The office of Morrison and Tate smelled faintly of dust and leather, the kind of place where time seemed to linger in the folds of old case files. I sat stiffly in a worn leather chair, my hands knotted together in my lap. My husband, Robert, and I had spent 3 decades building a life in Burlington, Vermont, and I believed the reading of his will would be a solemn formality, not a reckoning. Across from me, Damian adjusted the knot of his silk tie. He was 33, polished, every inch the Boston attorney he had become. His jaw was set with expectation, and for a moment I wondered if he knew something I didn't. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat, his glasses slipping down his nose as he unfolded the document. To my beloved wife, Evelyn Calloway, he began, and my heart gave a small leap. I leave the cabin on Pine Creek Road and all of its contents. The words sank in slowly. Pine Creek, that rotting old hunting cabin in the Green Mountains. A place we'd avoided for years because it was unlivable. I stared at Morrison, certain he had misread, but he pressed on. To my son, Damian Calloway, I leave the family residence in Burlington, along with all bank accounts, investments, and the sum of $9 million. The air drained from the room. $9 million. The house I had tended for 25 years. Everything we had built together. Gone in a breath. There must be a mistake, I whispered. Damian leaned back, a thin smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. His eyes, cold and triumphant, met mine. No mistake. Mother. Dad knew exactly what he was doing. Morrison glanced at me with something like pity, but his voice remained firm. The terms are clear. Mrs. Calloway, your husband was explicit. We left in silence, the April sun glaring against the windows as if mocking my blindness. I had trusted Robert completely, never doubting his loyalty. And now I was walking beside a son who could barely conceal his satisfaction. As we reached the parking lot, Damian's polished shoes clicked on the pavement with confidence, while mine seemed to stumble. He was already imagining a future of abundance, and I was left with a cabin crumbling into the earth. The ride back to Burlington was quiet, but I could feel his anticipation rising like heat, pressing against me until it became unbearable. The house in Burlington had always been my anchor. Every creak of the floorboards, every photo on the mantel carried pieces of my life with Robert. But the day after the will was read, it no longer felt like mine. Damian stood in the living room, his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair, as if he already owned every inch. "You'll need to be out by next week," he said, his tone casual, like discussing a business deadline. I froze, still holding the teacup I had poured that morning. Out. This has been my home for 25 years. He didn't flinch. And now it's mine. You have the cabin. You'll manage. His voice hardened as he added, "Go live with the pigs." Poor old woman. The words cut deeper than the will itself. My own son. The boy I had nursed through winter fevers, now speaking to me like a stranger. I set the cup down before my hand, betrayed my shaking. That night, I began packing. I folded clothes into 2 suitcases, careful to choose only what I truly needed. When I reached for the porcelain tea set my mother had given me, Damian appeared in the doorway. "Not that," he said flatly. "It was mine long before this house." I replied, "It stays." It came with the estate. His eyes narrowed, daring me to resist. I let the set rest on the shelf, my chest tightening with humiliation. Every item I touched felt like another piece of myself slipping away. Photographs, Robert's books, even the quilt I had stitched the year Damian was born. I packed quietly while he lingered nearby, making sure I didn't take what he deemed too valuable. On the 7th morning, I carried my suitcases down the steps. Damian leaned against the doorframe, scrolling on his phone, barely acknowledging me. When I passed, He finally looked up and said, "Try not to embarrass yourself out there. You never did know how to live on your own." I walked past him, the April wind sharp against my face, and loaded the bags into my old Honda. The driveway felt longer than it ever had before. With each step, the house behind me shrank into something unrecognizable. No longer a home, but a reminder of everything I had lost. I started the engine and turned toward Pine Creek Road, the road that would carry me to the cabin I hadn't seen in decades. The road to Pine Creek narrowed with each mile, trading smooth pavement for gravel, then gravel for dirt, carved between maples and birches just waking into spring. My old Honda rattled as I climbed the last stretch, branches scraping the sides like bony fingers. When the cabin finally appeared, it looked even worse than memory had allowed. The roof sagged as if the house itself had grown tired of standing. One window gaped empty, its glass shattered long ago. The porch tilted, the railing missing in places. Robert had inherited the place from his father, but we had always dismissed it as too costly to repair, too far from town to be useful. Now it was all I had. I pushed the door open with my shoulder, and a wave of must and wood smoke rolled out. Dust motes drifted in the pale light, landing on warped floorboards that groaned under my weight. No plumbing, no electricity, only a rusted stove in the corner and a mattress eaten by mice. Still, I set my suitcases down, the echo of their thud answering with silence. That night, I spread an old blanket across the floor and lay, staring through a hole in the roof. Stars pricked the sky above me, cold and indifferent. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, but the chill sank into my bones. Sleep brought no comfort, only memories. Damian at 7, wheezing through another asthma attack while I sat upright beside his bed, counting his breaths until dawn. Damian at 12, sulking over missed soccer games because I insisted he carry his inhaler. Damian at 18, striding across the graduation stage in a suit I had bought secondhand, his face glowing with pride while I clapped until my hands stung. I had given up a career I once loved, teaching history at the community college, to be home whenever he needed me. Robert had said it was best, that our son required stability. I had agreed, believing sacrifice was the language of love. Now the boy I had built my life around had cast me into exile. Tears slipped down my cheeks, soaking the edge of the blanket. For the first time since Robert's death, I wept without restraint, the sound breaking against the empty walls. Yet beneath the grief, a stubborn ember remained. I would not let Damian's cruelty finish me. As morning broke, pale light spilling across the ruined floor, I sat up and looked at the sagging roof with new eyes. If this cabin was all I had left, I would find a way to make it stand again. The days at Pine Creek blurred into a rhythm of chores and silence. I swept dust from corners, patched cracks with rags, and hauled water from the creek. But the hardest weight came not from labor. It came from the telephone that no longer rang. At first, I thought grief explained the silence. Then Martha Henderson, my neighbor from down the road, stopped by with a pie and uneasy eyes. "Damian's been talking," she said gently. "Says you made a scene at the lawyer's office, that you tried to grab papers and had to be pulled back." My throat tightened. I hadn't raised my voice once in that office, yet the lie fit too neatly into the picture he wanted to paint. A week later, my cousin Sarah called, her tone brittle. "Maybe it's best you let go of the money. Evelyn, it doesn't look good, carrying on this way." Carrying on, I hadn't asked for a cent beyond what was mine. Yet already, I was branded greedy. Soon, the calls stopped altogether. Invitations to Sunday dinners and birthdays vanished. Even Linda, my sister-in-law who had once leaned on me after her divorce, told me kindly but firmly that she needed space. Damian's story had reached them all. The widow turned bitter, desperate, clinging to what wasn't hers. Each silence cut deeper than the last. I could withstand the cold nights, the hunger that gnawed at me when groceries ran low. But the thought of my own family believing I had lost my dignity hollowed me out. Exile had stretched beyond these mountains. It had followed me into bloodlines I once thought unbreakable. One evening, as the wind rattled loose boards, I realized Damian wasn't content with taking the house. He was taking my place in the family story. The porch had become my small project, a place to steady my hands when grief threatened to overtake me. One afternoon, as I pried up a loose plank to replace it, my crowbar caught on something metallic wedged deep in the wood. At first, I thought it was a nail, but when I pulled harder, a small object clattered free onto the dusty boards. It was a key, heavy brass, cool against my palm. Strange markings were etched along its shaft. Not letters, but symbols that seemed almost carved by hand. I turned it over, the weight of it oddly deliberate, as though it had been waiting for me. Curiosity carried me to the cellar. The air down there was damp, filled with the scent of earth and mildew. I swept my lantern across stone walls patched with moss, the beams catching on cobwebs that sagged like old lace. In the far corner, half hidden by a warped shelf, was a square outline in the wall I had never noticed before. I dragged the shelf aside, and there it was, a small metal door, no larger than a bread box, its lock etched with the same strange markings as the key. My pulse quickened as the key slid into place and turned with a crisp click. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow cavity. Inside rested a thick manila envelope tied with twine and a smaller tin box. I carried them upstairs, my hands trembling. On the table, I untied the envelope and spread out its contents. Maps, deeds, and survey documents spilled across the wood. The words leapt at me: mineral rights, extraction boundaries, 200 acres, Pine Creek Valley. My eyes skimmed reports, stamped with state seals dating back decades, some in Robert's familiar handwriting. I opened the tin box last. Folded neatly inside was a letter addressed to me. My breath caught at the sight of his script. My dearest Evelyn, it began. If you are reading this, then you know I chose a path that must have felt cruel. Damian inherited the house and the money because I knew he would squander them. But the cabin this place you see as worthless holds what matters. The land beneath it is yours. I secured the rights years ago during my forestry work. I never told Damian, because he would have tried to take them. I trust you, Evelyn. I always knew you had the patience and the strength to discover what lies beneath these hills. The paper blurred as tears welled. My exile was not punishment. It was preparation, and hidden in this forgotten valley was something that could change everything. The next week, I drove into Montpellier with the envelope of documents tucked carefully inside my bag. The trip felt dangerous, as if at any moment Damian might appear and demand to know what I was carrying. I kept reminding myself that he had no idea the cabin was more than timber and dust. Charles Mercer, a lawyer recommended by an old friend, greeted me with the quiet professionalism of someone who had seen families torn apart over less. His office smelled of cedar and ink, his desk stacked neatly with files. When I spread Robert's papers before him, he adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, eyes narrowing in concentration. "These are extraordinary," he murmured, flipping through survey maps and signed deeds. Robert secured mineral rights over Pine Creek Valley, 200 acres, if I'm reading correctly. And these signatures are airtight. They're entirely in your name. Mrs. Calloway. I felt the ground shift beneath me. What exactly does that mean? It means your son cannot contest them, he said firmly. They were filed separately from his inheritance, legally. This is yours alone. The relief nearly knocked the breath from my chest. For weeks, I had felt like a ghost, discarded and erased. Now, here was proof that Robert had not abandoned me. He had trusted me with something far greater. At Mercer's urging, I hired an independent geologist. Dr. Martin Reeves arrived in muddy boots, carrying equipment that clanked as he hauled it up the slope. For 3 days he surveyed the land, taking samples, measuring ridges, walking the valley as if listening to the earth itself. When he handed me his report, his eyes gleamed. Your property sits on deposits of high-quality quartz, with significant seams of amethyst and most promising green tourmaline. Conservatively, the rights could fetch between $10 and $15 million, perhaps more with careful extraction. I stared at the figures, the weight of the number heavy yet strangely liberating. Damian's 9 million seemed smaller now, brittle compared to what lay quietly beneath these hills. That night, I sat at the cabin table with Robert's letter beside me. He had known Damian would burn through his fortune. He had known I would endure long enough to find this. He had trusted not only my survival, but my patience. For the first time since his death, I felt more than grief. I felt power, and I would hold it close, quietly, until the moment came to use it. News of Damian reached me long before he ever set foot near the cabin. In Burlington, people talked. Neighbors who had once admired him now whispered about his new Porsche gleaming in the driveway, the parties that spilled into the early morning, the women he entertained in restaurants I could never have afforded. He jetted off to Paris for a weekend, then to Madrid the next month, plastering photographs across social media of wine cellars and private clubs. Even in Montpellier, I heard his name. At the bank, a clerk leaned toward another with a shake of her head. Another loan request from Callaway, she murmured, thinking I wasn't listening. Already mortgaged part of his inheritance, and it's barely been half a year. At the post office, Martha Henderson passed me my mail with a frown. Evelyn, I hate to bring gossip, but folks say Damian already owes over $200,000. That boy is burning money faster than firewood in January. I thanked her quietly and walked back to the cabin. The envelope of bills pressed against my chest. Inside, I set them down and stared at the maps Robert had left me. Damian thought himself the victor. Standing in the house I had scrubbed and mended for decades, yet while he drowned himself in luxury, I was learning patience, the kind Robert had trusted me to hold. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son, who once accused me of never contributing, was hollowing himself out with debts he couldn't repay. And I, the discarded widow, held the one asset he could neither touch nor imagine. It was only a matter of time before his glittering world began to crack, and I knew where he would come when it did. The sound of tires on gravel broke the afternoon stillness. I looked out through the warped frame of the cabin window and saw a battered sedan inching up the drive. Gone was the gleaming Porsche that had once been Damian's pride. This car looked borrowed, tired, and out of place. He stepped out slowly, shoulders hunched, his expensive suits traded for a wrinkled shirt that hung loose at the collar. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the cabin as though it might swallow him. Then he knocked, softer than I had ever heard from him. "Mother?" he said when I opened the door, his voice raw. "I need your help." I folded my arms. "You made it clear I was no longer your concern." He swallowed hard, eyes darting to the floor. They've gotten complicated. I owe $400,000. If I don't pay soon, I'll lose everything, my house, my career. Please, I'm begging you." A storm of feelings rose in me. Rage that he would dare after casting me out. Sorrow that he had sunk so low, and beneath it all an ember of compassion I couldn't smother. He was still my son. Though he had tried to forget I was his mother, I let him twist in silence until he lifted his head, eyes shining with something that almost looked like fear. "Please, I'll do anything." "You will," I said at last. "I'll lend you what you need, but it won't be a gift. You'll repay me with 5% interest over 10 years. Every Saturday you'll come here to work manual labor. No excuses. And you will write a letter of apology for the lies you spread, to be read aloud at our next family gathering." His face drained of color. For a moment I thought he'd refuse, but then his shoulders sagged. "I agree." He signed the terms at my kitchen table, hands shaking. For the first time in years, the power had shifted, and I intended to use it wisely. The first Saturday he came, Damian arrived in jeans and an old sweatshirt. He looked awkward, holding an axe, his hands soft from years of offices and easy living. Still, he split logs while I stacked them, sweat rolling down his temples. Week after week he returned, mending the sagging fence, hauling brush, even cleaning the soot-blackened stove. He grumbled sometimes, but the arrogance was gone. Each blister seemed to strip away a layer of his old self. By December, a rhythm had settled between us. We worked in silence more often than not, but silence no longer felt like distance. It was as though the land itself was teaching him what no lecture ever could. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered at my sister's house in Montpellier. I had not seen many of them since Damian's stories turned them against me. Faces that once looked away now studied me with cautious curiosity. Damian stood in front of them holding a folded sheet of paper, his voice unsteady. "I need to tell the truth," he began. "I lied about my mother. She never attacked anyone, never begged for money. I said those things to protect my pride, but all I did was destroy her reputation. She sacrificed everything for me, and I repaid her with cruelty." The room was still, broken only by the rustle of his paper. When he finished, no one spoke for a long time. Then Sarah, who had once repeated his lies, crossed the room to take my hand. Others followed. Soft apologies murmured. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt my dignity restored not by money or hidden deeds, but by the truth finally spoken aloud. As we left that night, Damian walked behind me, his shoulders bowed, no longer the victor but the penitent. A year after Robert's will had stripped me of everything familiar, I opened the front door of a farmhouse perched above Lake Champlain. White clapboard walls gleamed in the sun, and the wide porch looked out over water that stretched toward the Adirondacks. It was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. I had invited Damian for tea, not out of duty, but because I wanted him to see what patience had built. When he arrived, he stepped from a modest sedan, looking smaller than I remembered. His eyes widened as he took in the house. "Mother," he whispered, How is this possible?" I poured the tea slowly, letting the silence sit between us before I answered. "Do you remember the cabin you thought was a punishment? Your father knew what he was doing. The mineral rights under Pine Creek were worth more than everything he left you." Damian stared, mouth parting, but no words coming. He lowered himself into a chair, shock softening the sharp edges of his face. "You squandered $9 million in less than a year," I continued gently. But I waited. I listened. And I used what he entrusted to me wisely. This house is not just brick and timber. It is the proof that discipline outlives arrogance. He dropped his gaze. And for once, no defiance remained. In that silence, I felt no need to gloat. The truth was enough. Looking out across the lake, I thought of Robert. He had known both of us too well, Damian's hunger for easy triumph, and my stubborn will to endure. Wealth, I realized, was never in the numbers. It was in the strength to survive betrayal and still rise. And that was an inheritance no one could take from me.